The torches flicker, casting long, jagged shadows across the stone walls of Holyrood Palace. Somewhere beyond the heavy oak doors, laughter has only just died. The corridors moments ago, alive with whispers of servants, now echo with the thunder of boots. It is not the march of soldiers into battle, but the ruthless cadence of murder moving swiftly through the night. The Queen is 7 months pregnant, her hand resting over the fragile swell of her belly. At her side sits David Rizzio, her secretary, her confidant, a foreigner who should never have risen so high in the eyes of Scotland's nobles. He does not hear it at first, or perhaps he refuses to believe. The distant slam of a door, the creak of armour, the sudden silence that feels heavier than sound itself. But Mary feels it a shift in the air, an icy tremor of something unnatural. Then the door bursts open. Steel flashes in the torchlight, and the men pour in lords, dressed not for ceremony, but for slaughter. Their faces are grim masks, hardened not by fear, but by purpose. At their head, hidden like a serpent in the grass, is her own husband. Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, the Queen's consort, who only hours ago had touched her hand with tenderness, now offers her betrayal. Rizzio stands confused, frightened, clinging to Mary's skirts, like a drowning man grasping driftwood. But there is no refuge here. The room erupts in chaos. A hand seizes him by the sleeve, another at the collar, dragging him away, as Mary cries out, her voice breaking with desperation. The child inside her stirs in protest, as though even the unborn senses the violence tearing through the night. The air is thick with rage and jealousy, the stink of sweat and steel. They hurl Rizzio into the outer chamber, pinning him against the wall as blades are drawn. He begs, pleads, but his words are drowned by the scrape of steel against stone, by the rising chant of death that echoes in the pounding of boots and the beating of his heart. The first blade plunges into flesh. A gasp, then another stab, and another. Each thrust is not simply murder, it is mutilation, ritual punishment. 50 times steel bites through skin and sinew, and still they do not stop. The body convulses, twitches, collapses, but the frenzy only intensifies. It is not enough for him to die. He must be desecrated, erased. Inside her chamber, Mary hears everything. The thud of bodies, the slash of knives, the final choking gurgle of a man who had been her closest companion. She screams not only for Rizzio, but for her unborn child, for the terror seeping into the very walls of Holyrood, for the betrayal that will mark her reign in blood. When at last the silence comes, it is not peace. It is a void. The torches hiss in the draught, their flames trembling over blood that slicks the flagstones. The Queen is alone now, trembling, violated, not in body but in spirit. And on the floor beyond those doors lies a corpse stabbed more than 50 times. So we must ask, how could this happen within a palace meant to symbolize order and majesty? How could a queen's own husband conspire to spill so much blood under his wife's roof? Tonight, we peel back the velvet curtains of royalty and look directly into the eyes of treachery. The brutal murder of David Rizzio was not merely an act of jealousy, it was a calculated spectacle of terror. And it is here in this blood-soaked chamber that our journey begins. Imagine stepping back in time, away from the carnage and the echo of screams, into a world that gleams with deceptive brilliance. The year is 1566, and Mary Queen of Scots reigns in a fragile, glittering balance. To her subjects, she is the embodiment of majesty itself, tall, elegant, radiant in silks and jewels that shimmer in candlelight. Her presence can silence a hall. Her voice, musical and deliberate, carries the promise of both charm and authority. She is young. barely 23, yet she wears a crown that weighs heavier than most men could bear in a lifetime. At her side, not in the bedchamber, but in the council room, sits David Rizzio. A man of humble birth from Turin, Italy, he is no noble, no warrior, no statesman. He is a musician, a man whose voice once carried melodies before foreign courts. Through talent, wit, and an uncanny instinct for survival, he has ascended from obscurity to the highest circles of Scottish power. In Mary he found not just a patron, but a kindred soul. He became her secretary, her counsellor, her trusted companion. To the Queen he is indispensable. To her enemies he is intolerable. But on the surface, none of this darkness shows. Holyrood Palace is alive with grandeur. Banquets spill over with wine, venison and laughter. Courtiers bow deeply, their smiles carefully painted. Musicians strum lutes and viols, while Mary listens intently, her hand absently caressing the gentle swell of her belly, the future heir of Scotland growing within. The Queen is radiant, and with her radiance comes an intoxicating illusion of stability. This is the flawless picture, a monarch beloved by her servants, a court bound by ceremony, a realm gilded with splendor. Even her marriage, though turbulent, is still paraded as a union of royal strength. Lord Darnley, handsome and of noble blood, seems the perfect consort. In portraits, his youth glows beside hers. Together, they appear as the golden pair destined to unite a fractured kingdom. It is an image as fragile as glass. Behind the velvet curtains, the court is a nest of serpents. The nobles, proud of their ancient bloodlines, grind their teeth as they watch a foreigner, an Italian of no lineage, whisper into their queen's ear. Darnley, once content with the glow of his queen's affection, now simmers with humiliation, overshadowed by a man who was never meant to wield influence. And yet to the casual eye, to the visiting ambassador, to the people gathered in the streets of Edinburgh, all seems calm. This is the cruel irony of history. The closer we are to perfection, the more brittle it becomes. Every banquet, every laugh, every whispered melody Rizzio offers at Mary's side is another stroke of paint on a masterpiece destined to shatter. For now, the scene is flawless. A queen in her glory, a trusted confidant, a kingdom seemingly secure. But if you look closely, listen carefully, you can already hear the faint crack forming beneath the polished surface. And when glass shatters, it cuts deep. The first cracks in a flawless picture rarely announce themselves with thunder. They creep in quietly, like the faint drip of water through stone, until the entire foundation begins to rot. In Mary's court, those cracks came in whispers. At first, they were no more than rumours. Courtiers muttered behind heavy tapestries, suggesting that David Rizzio's influence over the Queen had grown unnatural. Some whispered of dark counsel, others of secret love. The idea was poisonous, yet intoxicating. Could the Queen's Italian secretary, a man of no noble blood, be more than a servant? Could he be the true father of the child she carried? It was slander, a vile distortion. But in an age where perception meant survival, whispers were as lethal as daggers. Lord Darnley heard them all. He had once been the golden consort, handsome young with the kind of noble bloodline that made him a natural match for Mary. But power has a cruel way of exposing weakness. Darnley's pride was as fragile as it was great. Every decision Mary made without him, every moment she spent in Rizzio's council, deepened his humiliation. He began to imagine himself a king denied his throne, his authority mocked by the presence of a low-born foreigner. The nobles, sensing his insecurity, fanned the flames. They despised Rizzio as much as Darnley did, but for different reasons. To them, Rizzio was an infection within the body politic, a foreign parasite feeding at Scotland's royal heart. They resented his proximity to Mary, his growing wealth, his subtle but undeniable hand in matters of state. yet to move openly against him would be dangerous. To strike at the Queen's favourite was to strike at the Queen herself. Unless, of course, her own husband could be persuaded to lead the charge. And so the first symptoms of conspiracy appeared: hushed meetings in smoky chambers, promises whispered into Darnley's ear, promises that his wounded pride would be healed if only Rizzio were removed. To Darnley, it was a cure not just for jealousy, but for humiliation. To the nobles, it was the beginning of a larger coup. The Queen, radiant and expectant, did not see it clearly at first. Perhaps she refused to. She had built her world around loyalty and trust, her trust in Rizzio above all. But even she could feel the tension tightening in the air. Darnley's eyes grew cold when they fell upon her secretary. The courtiers' bows became stiff, their voices edged with contempt. And sometimes late at night, when Mary lay awake in the dim glow of the hearth, she may have wondered, was the life inside her the promise of Scotland's future, or a curse waiting to be born into treachery? The sickness of betrayal had begun to spread. It was subtle still, but unmistakable. The air in Holyrood was heavier. The Queen's laughter carried a sharper edge, and behind every smile, every toast, every soft strum of music there lurked the shadow of knives waiting to be drawn. The symptoms were here, and soon they would become impossible to ignore. The trap does not spring in an instant. It is wound tight over weeks, like a noose slowly drawn around a neck until one final tug makes the world collapse. For Henry Stuart Lord Darnley, that noose was forged from jealousy, pride, and the cold manipulations of Scotland's lords. They came to him not as conspirators, but as saviours. They whispered of his dishonour, of how the people mocked him behind closed doors, and laughed at how his wife leaned more on a foreign secretary than on her own husband. They painted a picture of betrayal so vivid that Darnley could not help but see it everywhere, in Rizzio's careful bow, in Mary's trusting glance, even in the swelling curve of her womb. The child she carried, some whispered, might not even be his. For a man whose pride was already a festering wound, these whispers became unbearable. The nobles knew this. They fed his paranoia, poured poison into his ears, until his humiliation became rage, and rage became resolved. By the time they unveiled their plan, Darnley was ready to believe it was his only cure. The plot was as brutal as it was calculated. On the night of March 9th, 1566, they would storm Holyrood Palace. They would seize Rizzio in front of the Queen herself, drag him from her protection, and butcher him where all could hear. It would not merely be an execution, it would be a spectacle. A message carved in blood showing Mary that her will could be broken, that her favourites could be destroyed before her very eyes. The promises made to Darnley were intoxicating. In exchange for his complicity, the lords would restore him to his rightful place beside Mary, not as a consort, but as a king, in fact. He would no longer be the shadowed husband, mocked and sidelined. He would be feared. He would obey. And Rizzio, the man who had stolen his dignity, would be reduced to a corpse riddled with holes. The conspirators moved in silence, binding themselves by oath and blood. Every detail was arranged: the guards who would be bribed, the doors that would be left unbarred, the timing chosen, so the Queen would be cornered defenceless, unable to summon help. Holyrood, the very palace meant to protect her, would become her prison. And on that night, as the Queen dined in her private chambers with Rizzio and a few trusted companions, the plot began to move. The doors were shut. The corridors darkened. And from below, from the echoing stairways, came the sound of armoured boots marching upward. Mary sensed something first. A change in the air, a silence too heavy for an ordinary evening. Her hand moved instinctively to her belly, as though her unborn child might need shielding from a danger she could not yet name. Rizzio, distracted, perhaps thought little of it, until the door shuddered under the weight of fists and iron. The trap had been set for weeks. Now it has sprung. The door splintered inward with a crash that shook the chamber like a cannon shot. The Queen's hand flew to her belly, instinctive, desperate as men flooded into the room with drawn swords and murder in their eyes. David Rizzio, seated only moments before, with a cup of wine at his lips, staggered to his feet. His first thought was not of himself, but of her. He moved to her side, clinging to her skirts as though proximity to the Queen might shield him from the storm. But there is no shield against betrayal when it comes from within the family itself. Lord Darnley Mary's own husband entered with the conspirators, his expression cold, his silence more damning than any accusation. For a fleeting instant, Mary searched his face, pleading without words. Surely he would stop this madness. Surely he would not allow armed men to invade her private chamber to threaten her in her condition. But Darnley's eyes were void, emptied of love, emptied of loyalty. Rizzio clung harder, his hands trembling, his voice rising in desperate pleas. He swore innocence. He begged for mercy. The Queen's chamber echoed with his cries, with Mary's frantic commands to leave him be. Her voice, shrill with terror, carried the authority of a monarch and the desperation of a woman soon to be a mother. Yet, the men advancing cared for neither crown nor unborn child. They seized him by the collar, dragging him toward the door, as Mary struggled to hold him back. She wrapped her arms around him, her cries piercing the night, and in that grotesque tug of war, she felt the brutal force of steel against her own body as one conspirator pressed a pistol to her swollen belly. The message was clear: let go, or the child dies before it takes its first breath. That moment was not only Rizzio's terror, it was Mary's psychological crucifixion. She was forced to choose between clinging to her loyal servant and protecting the life inside her. Her body shook, her will buckled, and with a scream torn from the depths of her soul, she let them drag him away. Imagine the loneliness of that instant. For Rizzio, ripped from the one person who might have defended him, there was no court of law, no trial, no chance of appeal. His only defense had been the Queen's embrace, and even that had been wrenched away. He must have known his life was already over. Every step toward the outer chamber was a step into the grave. And for Mary, it was a battle she could never win. She remained behind in the chamber, her hands shaking, her skirts torn, where Rizzio had clung, her ears filled with the sounds of her friend being dragged across the stone floor. She was a queen, yet utterly powerless, a mother-to-be, yet unable to shield her unborn child from terror. Surrounded by enemies betrayed by her husband, she was isolated in a prison made of her own palace walls. This was the lonely battle not fought with swords or shields, but with helpless tears, strangled screams, and the crushing realization that she had been stripped of every weapon except endurance. Rizzio was alone in his terror. Mary was alone in her despair. And together they stood in the shadow of a fate already written in blood. The knives had not yet struck 50 times, but already the conspirators spoke of their crime as if it were medicine. To them, David Rizzio was not a man of flesh and breath. He was an infection, a tumour festering in the heart of Scotland's monarchy, and their solution, their cure, was bloodletting. They cloaked their savagery in the language of healing. This foreigner they spat has bewitched the Queen. He whispers poison into her ear, steals honours, meant for true Scots, corrupts the throne with foreign influence. By removing him, they insisted they were purifying the body of the realm. It was a surgeon's logic twisted into barbarity, but beneath the rhetoric lay uglier motives. Darnley's pride had been bruised beyond repair, his manhood mocked in whispers that claimed Rizzio had supplanted him not only in the council chamber, but in the Queen's bed. The noble, stripped of privileges and furious at Mary's reforms, longed for a scapegoat. And so they dressed their envy, their paranoia, their lust for power in the garb of righteousness. They called their coup a cure, when in truth it was nothing but a disease. History has seen this pattern before and will see it again, violence masquerading as medicine cruelty, justified as necessity. In ancient courts, leeches were pressed to flesh to drain out imagined poisons. Here in the Palace of Holyrood, knives became the leeches tearing Rizzio's body apart, as if each stab were extracting corruption. But leeches do not cure the body when it is healthy. They only weaken it further. Mary knew this in her bones. Even as she screamed for her secretary, even as she fought to preserve the fragile life within her, she must have understood the bitter irony they claimed to be saving her from Rizzio, but their true target was her. By murdering her closest confidant, they hoped to isolate her, break her, control her. What they called a cure was nothing less than mutilation of her power, her spirit, her very identity as a queen. And what of Rizzio himself? Dragged through the chamber, his fingers clawing at the doorframe, he too must have heard their words. Imagine the anguish of being reduced to a parasite in their eyes, of knowing that your life was not being taken for who you were, but for what you represented. He was no longer David Rizzio, musician counselor and loyal friend. He had been transformed into a disease, a symbol that could be eradicated without mercy. The futility of these cures is written in blood across the history of power. Ignorance dressed as wisdom, brutality posing as salvation. The nobles believed that by stabbing Rizzio, they were restoring order. Darnley believed that by humiliating his wife, he was reclaiming his honour. Yet every knife thrust only deepened Scotland's sickness, widened the fractures, and sowed the seeds of future ruin. In the cold torchlight of Holyrood, the cure became the very contagion it claimed to fight. And the patient, the monarchy itself, would never recover. The tragedy of David Rizzio's death becomes sharper when we retrace the final days of his life, the quiet hours before the storm, when neither he nor the Queen yet realised how close death was stalking them through the corridors of Holyrood. Rizzio was no warrior. He was a man of song, a secretary whose weapons were paper, ink and melody. In those last days, he lived as he always had, moving in the Queen's orbit, attending her with quiet diligence. He dined at her table, shared in her laughter, soothed her anxieties as the weight of pregnancy and politics pressed down on her shoulders. To Mary, he was more than an advisor. He was a companion who lightened her burdens with music and loyalty. Picture him on the eve of his murder, seated at supper in the warm glow of the Queen's chamber. The air filled with the smells of roasted meats, of spiced wine, of beeswax candles dripping softly onto silver plates. Outside, the March wind scraped against the stone walls of Holyrood. But inside, there was laughter, conversation, even a fragile sense of peace. The Queen leaned back in her chair, her hand resting absently on her belly, listening as Rizzio hummed the faint strains of an Italian tune from his youth. Perhaps he sang for her, perhaps only for himself. But at that moment, the palace seemed almost safe. And yet even in those final hours, unease lingered like a shadow in the corners of the room. The Queen felt it, the chill in her husband's glances, the stiffness of courtiers who once smiled freely, the subtle silence that fell whenever she drew too close to Rizzio. Did Rizzio feel it too? Did he sense that his every gesture, every word spoken in Mary's confidence, was being weighed against him in secret councils? He was intelligent enough to know the danger. And still he stayed. His loyalty was his undoing. Other men might have fled, returned to Italy, abandoned a queen whose throne sat on shifting sands. But Rizzio remained at Mary's side. Perhaps he believed her crown would protect him. Perhaps he believed that friendship, that trust, that music itself could hold back the knives already being sharpened for his flesh. In those last days, there were no grand speeches, no preparation for martyrdom. Rizzio was not a man who imagined himself dying for history. He was simply a man doing his duty, unaware that every bite of roasted venison, every sip of dark red wine, every note of melody hummed in the Queen's presence was a farewell ritual. When he lifted his glass at that final supper, perhaps offering a toast to Mary's health, to the safe delivery of her child, he could not have known that before dawn his body would lie broken in the corridor, his blood pooling into the stones of Holyrood. He laughed softly, ate heartily, spoke with warmth, lived fully right up to the edge of the knife. It is the tender details that make the horror unbearable. A final song, a final meal, a final evening spent in trust, unaware that the hours were being counted not by the ticking of a clock, but by the heartbeat of a conspiracy closing in. They dragged him into the outer chamber like an animal for slaughter. David Rizzio's cries echoed off the stone walls, desperate, frantic, half-choked with terror. His hands clawed at door frames, his heels scraped against the flagstones. But the men who held him were fueled by something stronger than muscle. They were driven by hate, by jealousy, by the fever of conspiracy. The room is filled with shadows and steel, torches guttered in the draught, casting a hellish glow across faces twisted not with pity, but with grim satisfaction. Mary's chamber door slammed behind them, leaving her imprisoned with her terror, unable to save the man who had served her so faithfully. She heard every sound, every thud, every curse, every strike. The first knife cut deep, plunging into his side. His body convulsed his breath, escaping in a strangled cry, but they did not stop. Another blade, then another. The frenzy began. 56 wounds, steel raked through flesh and sinew, tearing him apart piece by piece. They stabbed his face, his chest, his hands, as if trying to erase every trace of the man who had dared stand so near the Queen. The sound was sickening. The wet rip of blades, sliding out the dull thud of a body collapsing and being yanked upright again for further torment. His blood spattered the walls, pooled across the stone floor, seeped into the cracks as though the palace itself would forever drink in the memory of this night. Some said the stain remained for years, a silent witness to treachery. But this was no simple killing. It was a theatre. Each wound was a message, every slash a performance for the Queen who sat trapped behind the door. She was meant to hear his agony, to know that her protection could be torn from her, that her closest companion could be butchered without mercy. This was not just the destruction of a man, it was the symbolic mutilation of her power. Imagine his final moments. His body shaking uncontrollably, eyes wide with the realization that death was not coming swiftly, but in 1,000 cuts. His lungs filling with blood, his voice reduced to gasps, to gurgles, until even that was stolen from him. The human face of loyalty and music reduced to a mask of horror, slackened in death. When it was finished, the men left his body sprawled across the floor, his features scarcely recognizable, his fine clothes shredded into blood-soaked rags. He was no longer Rizzio, secretary to the Queen. He was a husk, a warning, a grotesque relic left to rot on the palace stones. Mary was forced to pass by him later, her condition fragile, her spirit shattered. Imagine her eyes falling on what was once her friend, now a ruin of flesh. Imagine the weight of knowing that his blood had been spilled, not by strangers, not by invading armies, but by her own husband and the lords sworn to her service. The palace was quiet again, but it was not peaceful. It was silence born of exhaustion, the eerie calm that follows slaughter. The air still smelled of iron and sweat, of death and betrayal. And in that silence the true rotting began, not only of Rizzio's body, but of Mary's reign, her marriage, and the fragile trust that once bound a kingdom together. Morning came. but it did not bring light. The corridors of Holyrood still reeked of iron and smoke, the blood of David Rizzio seeping stubbornly between the flagstones. Servants whispered of a ghostly stain that no scrubbing could erase, as though the palace itself refused to forget. Word of the murder spread with unnatural speed. The story was told and retold, twisted and magnified, that Rizzio had been torn apart like an animal, that he had been stabbed in the face to obliterate his identity, that his corpse had been desecrated even after death. Rumours claimed his body bore more than 50 wounds, each delivered not in haste, but in frenzied cruelty. Others whispered that he had been dragged across the floor while still alive. His screams silenced only when his throat was slashed. Whether true or exaggerated, the effect was the same. The image of his mutilation took root in Scotland's imagination. For Mary, the horror was personal. Her chamber had been violated. Her authority mocked her body, threatened her closest friend, butchered within earshot. She emerged, pale, trembling, but alive, and carrying within her the fragile heir to Scotland's throne. The conspirators had failed to break her completely, but they had inflicted a wound that would never heal. And what of the truth beneath the blood? It was no simple crime of passion. It was a coup dressed as jealousy, a calculated strike meant to cripple the Queen's will. Lord Darnley had allowed himself to become the perfect pawn, his pride so inflamed that he could not see how he was being used. The nobles had not murdered Rizzio out of spontaneous rage. They had plotted, rehearsed, sharpened their blades for weeks. This was political theatre of the darkest kind. A modern eye, cold and clinical, can see the psychology at play. Darnley was driven not by reason, but by humiliation, a man emasculated by his queen's independence and by the influence of a foreigner who outshone him in council. The lords acted from paranoia, convinced that Scotland was slipping into foreign hands, that their ancient power was eroding beneath the rise of a queen who trusted outsiders more than native blood. Together, their anxieties fused into violence. But violence never clarifies it, only corrodes. By murdering Rizzio, they hoped to restore order. Instead, they unleashed chaos. Mary's spirit hardened, her marriage shattered, her trust in Darnley extinguished. Within 2 years, he himself would be dead, strangled, and left in the ruins of Kirker Field. The nobles' conspiracy, meant to secure their dominance, only hastened their downfall. Rizzio's body was carried away, but his absence haunted every chamber of Holyrood. The Queen, left to face the future alone, bore the weight of his ghost in every decision, every glance, every nightmare. The truth was unveiled. His murder had not cured anything. It had poisoned everything. The echoes of that night did not fade with Rizzio's burial. They lingered, woven into the very fabric of Scotland's history, a stain not just on the stones of Holyrood, but on the soul of its monarchy. For Mary, the murder marked a turning point from which there was no return. She carried her child to term James, who would one day unite the crowns of Scotland and England, but she did so under the weight of betrayal. Every movement of her unborn son must have reminded her of the pistol pressed against her belly, of the choice forced upon her between her child's life and her friends. The conspiracy had sought to terrify her into submission. Instead, it hollowed her trust, corroded her marriage, and isolated her more than ever. Lord Darnley's triumph proved fleeting. The man who had thought himself reborn as a king found instead that he had doomed himself. His role in Rizzio's murder transformed him from consort into conspirator, from royal partner into hated betrayer. Within 2 years, his body would be found strangled in a garden, the victim of yet another web of intrigue. His lust for power had birthed only his own destruction. And what of Rizzio? His life was not grand, his rise not marked by armies or crowns, yet his death became legend. the murder that was supposed to erase him, ensured he would be remembered forever. His name clings to the story of Mary's reign like blood to stone, inescapable, haunting, immortal. Even today, the chamber at Holyrood is pointed out to visitors' guides, whispering of a ghostly stain that no scrubbing could remove. Some say Rizzio's spirit lingers there, trapped in the place of his slaughter, condemned to replay his agony in the echo of boots and the imagined glint of blades. Whether or not the ghost exists, the memory does. And that is its own kind of haunting. The irony is bitter. The nobles thought they were curing their queen of foreign influence, restoring the balance of power. Instead, they accelerated her downfall, setting into motion a chain of betrayals that would lead her to imprisonment, forced abdication, and eventually the executioner's blade in England. The attempt to silence one man's voice unleashed decades of turmoil. So we are left to wonder, when power grows, fragile, does it always demand blood? Is betrayal the natural language of crowns, the only cure rulers can imagine when fear grips their hearts? Or is it that once blood is spilled in the name of order, the stain can never be cleansed, only spread further until it swallows even those who first wielded the knife? History offers no easy answers, only the lingering echo of a scream in the dark, the sound of knives plunging again and again, and the memory of a queen forced to watch her world bleed before her eyes.